Nelson Mandela passed away at the age of 95, leaving behind a history of struggle and a historic rise to power. The apartheid system of South Africa in the 1980s caught the attention of the American media, and members of the public quickly moved to boycott South African goods. The market pressure, especially against their gold coin, the Krugerrand, helped propel Nelson Mandela to power. In the 1980s, Nelson Mandela became a symbol of the struggle for civil rights, but not everyone saw him in such a positive light. Mandela was the leader of the African National Congress and was considered by many to be a militant. Newly released documents show that the leader was considered a terrorist by the United States until 2008. The Reagan administration provided information to South Africa, allowing them to arrest Mandela. Like all fallen leaders, the legacy of Nelson Mandela is certain to be changed as time goes on. His natural human flaws will be minimized by history, as happened with John Kennedy. Bill Fletcher is a columnist for theblackcommentator.com. He was also the president of the Trans-Africa Forum. He's written about Mandela and how the late leader will be remembered. Fletcher is our guest on the show today, and he's here to talk to us about Nelson Mandela. We'll discuss the man, his political works, and his motivations. We'll also talk about his arrest and being labeled a terrorist by the United States government. We'll also talk about his rise to the presidency of his country and how he will be remembered. Welcome to the show, Bill.
Glad to be on the program.
Bill, what inspired Mandela to become involved in politics?
Well, I encourage your viewers and listeners to look at the new movie on Mandela, The Long Walk to Freedom, which I think is an outstanding portrayal of the development of Mandela. It has certain weaknesses, but what you see in that film is that you had this individual who set out to become a lawyer, who found that through the legal system, that the decks were stacked against him and against other people that believed in justice. And he was, as such, he was drawn into the movement and almost reluctantly drawn into the movement and became then a leader. And that's actually interesting because it's true with many great leaders. If you take, for example, Martin Luther King, he was in Montgomery, Alabama, and his intention had not been to go there to become a civil rights leader. He was drawn in to a movement, and that movement helped to transform him. And that's essentially what happened with Mandela.
Now, Bill, why did the Reagan administration, however, declare that he was a terrorist? Because
the United States' attitude towards South Africa since World War II was one of viewing the country as a strategic ally in the war against communism, in the fight against the Soviet Union and China. And the African National Congress looked to gain support from whoever would give them support. But it was the Soviet Union, it was East Germany, it was the Chinese that were very generous in providing them with support. The South African apartheid regime therefore declared the ANC to be a communist terrorist organization. And the United States lined up with that. Reagan had a very peculiar view of history, as it turns out, and said during the whole debate in Congress around sanctions that the South Africans had been, the South African apartheid regime had actually been allies of the United States and Britain during World War II. And that actually wasn't quite true. The people that were running the South Africa at that time, the Nationalist Party, were people who were, during World War II, covert and in some cases overt supporters of the Nazis. And so Reagan got this whole thing wrong, but it was consistent with his view that anyone that was opposed to communists was an ally. I think going even further, it shows you that this use of the term terrorist is not particularly helpful.
Well, we see the term terrorist thrown around quite a lot today, and
Right.
it's in every document put out by the Department of Homeland Security. Even simple Americans who are supporting presidential candidates have been labeled terrorists because they have bumper stickers on their cars. So it's no far stretch to see that administrations do get things wrong. But who was behind Mandela's rise to power?
The South African people. I mean, and I'm not trying to be funny. The South African freedom movement was a very complex movement that had a variety of different organizations. His organization, the African National Congress, was only one organization. There was the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, which was actually a split up from the ANC in the 1950s. You had the Azanian People's Organization. In the 1980s, you had the rise of the United Democratic Front, which brought together forces against apartheid. Mandela was able, because of his sophistication and diplomacy, was able to speak to many different audiences. And he believed in coalition building. He was able to build a very broad tent. And the South African people, the majority, masses of South African people, that resonated for them. And so they were behind his rise. Now, around the world, in addition, there were activists in the United States and Britain, all over, who took up the cause of opposing apartheid. And that movement, that global movement, also contributed to isolating South Africa and making it possible for democracy to be won.
Shifting to the tactics to overthrow apartheid, did Mandela use any violent tactics in order to achieve his goals?
Yes. After 50 years, more than 50 years of the ANC attempting to engage in peaceful protests, nonviolent direct action in some cases, the vicious repression carried out by the apartheid regime led the leaders of the ANC and the PAC to conclude that they could not rely on nonviolent means alone, and that they had to actually engage in armed struggle.
Well, so let me ask you this. Do you think that in today's day and age, we see many movements across the United States, and many people believe that the United States has fallen far from its constitutionally founded roots? Do you believe that because the way that Mandela is portrayed today, the way the administration has, I don't want to say deified, but has really, they put flags at half-mast. Do you believe that his tactics, those violent tactics, are also endorsed and would be, in fact, perhaps justified in today's America if the Constitution and the way that this nation was created continues to fall further and further from the founders' intent?
That's a very complicated question that has to be answered in different parts. So first of all, are there lessons from South Africa to today? And I would say, to the United States today, I'd say that there are lessons, but they have very little to do with armed struggle. They have to do with the necessity to build broad popular movements that believe in the necessity for a thorough democracy. I think in terms of the second part, it depends on what you mean by a country falling from the intent of the founding fathers. If
I could clarify, like I mentioned before, the federal government has declared American citizens terrorists in some instances because they have simply followed or supported candidates. And I will quote directly the Missouri Information Analysis Center, which was sourced through Department of Homeland Security and Southern Poverty Law Center documentation, that if you support a political candidate and you have a bumper sticker that has a historical flag on it, not the yellow flag, the "Don't Tread on Me" flag, or if you simply have seen films that discuss the Federal Reserve or the IRS, that document stated that to use extreme caution when approaching the individuals in those vehicles. There was a state police document, and that those people may be violent and may in fact be militia members. So when I refer to that moment, I'm speaking of how far the nation has come from people who simply advocate more freedom, less government, and when the government goes ahead and labels those individuals as threats.
Yeah, see, I think that this is what you're raising. There's a problem with what you're raising, in that we have militias. We have very violent right-wing militias in this country that are incredibly well armed, that have anti-tank weapons, quad 50s, MAC 10s, bazookas, and they have been willing to use these weapons on occasion. Now, if you're saying what you were describing, this document, which I've not seen, if this document is suggesting caution on the part of police officers, I think it's quite reasonable to suggest caution. I don't see that as the same thing as declaring Nelson Mandela to be a terrorist. I think that the declaration of Nelson Mandela as a terrorist was something completely different. And it was driven by attempting to crush the movement that was for democracy that was going on in South Africa. It was the aim was to make sure that a South African apartheid regime that was allied with the United States in the Cold War was preserved. That's quite a bit different than a bumper sticker.
Bill, how much support did the African National Congress enjoy in South Africa?
Well, they enjoyed enough to win the elections, and that much is clear. But what is not understood by many people in the United States is that there were other forces on the ground in South Africa, particularly the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, that enjoyed a very, very broad support among non-whites. So you have this very broad movement that exists there. The ANC remains.
Now going back to the topic of violence, why do you think that Mandela would not renounce violent actions of the African National Congress?
An apartheid regime would not renounce violence against the people.
Do you think that did the media accurately portray the system of apartheid?
I think that the media, in many ways, portrayed it, underplayed it. It was a cruel, cruel system, much like the Jim Crow segregation that it was modeled on that existed in the United States. It was a very barbaric system, and until the very end. And so I don't think that people fully appreciate the depth of its barbarism.
Bill, in the absence of Mandela on the world stage, who do you believe will pick up the reins of his fight for civil rights globally?
Yeah, I've been trying to think about that. I don't think that there's necessarily an individual. People like Mandela are the products of their generations and of certain kinds of struggles. And there are great people out there like Desmond Tutu and many younger people. Mandela was a unique figure, in part because the South African movement was a very unique movement. And the South African movement brought together such a cross-section of people from around the world in this battle for democracy and freedom. Mandela represented the South African people. He was the way that we met the South African people. And as such, he plays this role that is almost irreplaceable. There will be other people that will come forward that will be as great, but they will be great in a different way.
All right, Bill, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
All right, that was Bill Fletcher right here on WHDT World News. Stay tuned. We have the rest of today's headlines and all the news from Hollywood and a full report on the weather coming up right here on WHDT.